In this video, you will learn some background information about pivot tables in Microsoft Excel 2016. The training consists of learning about the major functions of pivot tables in Excel. The first video deals with some background information on creating and using pivot tables. The second is a series of videos demonstrating how to create 6 basic types of pivot tables, including a single field pivot tables that calculate and count values, 2 field pivot tables that calculate and count values, and creating a hierarchical pivot table that calculates and counts values. All of the pivot tables are built using a compact format. The third video covers the basics of sorting pivot tables. The fourth video looks at filtering or removing values temporarily from a pivot table to highlight specific relationships between fields. The fifth video covers grouping data. The sixth video takes a very quick look at formatting pivot tables. The seventh video looks at some topics related to calculations available in the pivot table and creating user-defined calculations. Finally, the 8th video looks at creating charts based upon pivot tables. Let's review some background information concerning pivot tables. A pivot table is a unique piece of software that allows users to create interactive summary reports based upon raw data provided by the user. Pivot table reports are interactive because the user may filter either the row headings or the column headings, changing the results displayed. Also, the user can change the calculations performed on the data. In addition, pivot tables allow row and column values to be sorted and grouped. Finally, pivot tables allow the user to change the placement of fields to get a different perspective on the data. Pivot tables have 3 important structures: a raw data set, a pivot cache, and the pivot table itself. The raw data set resides either in a worksheet or in an external database. The pivot cache is a hidden copy of the raw data set, which Excel uses as the basis for the pivot table. The pivot table summarizes the data in the pivot cache according to the needs of the end user of the pivot table. Conceptually, the user starts with a worksheet or a connection to a table of data in a database. After the user tells Excel what parts of the raw data set to include in the pivot table, Excel copies the selected data to the pivot cache. Both the creator and the consumer of the pivot table are unaware of the existence of the pivot cache, except in some circumstances where the user runs into issues with grouping or working with a particular type of calculation called a calculated field. Excel stores the pivot cache as part of the workbook. Once Excel creates a pivot cache, it creates a pivot table. Any subsequent pivot tables created by the user will use the same pivot cache unless the user deliberately creates a new pivot cache or selects a different set of data. The pivot table itself has 4 components: rows, columns, values, and filters. Rows, as the name suggests, run horizontally across tables and represent the values of the field placed in the row area of the pivot table. Columns, as the name suggests, run vertically and represent the values of the field placed in the columns area of the pivot table. Both the rows and columns represent variables that the user is seeking to discover a relationship between. Values form the intersection of the rows and columns and represent the data that the user thinks will show the relationship between the row values and the column values. The value section also creates grand totals. If the table contains groups, then subtotals will also appear. Filters allow the user of the pivot table to see how an external variable to the table impacts the relationship between the row values and the column values. There are some limitations to working with pivot tables that are useful to know. First, the number of fields placed in the rows area is limited to 1,048,576. Second, the number of fields placed in the columns area is limited to 16,384. Third, the number of fields placed in the value area is limited to 16,384 as well. Fourth, the number of fields placed in the filter area is also 16,384. The amount of memory on the computer limits the number of calculated fields, the number of calculated items, the number of pivot tables, and the number of pivot caches. If you're running the 32-bit version of Excel or the 32-bit version of Windows or 32-bit versions of both Excel and Windows, the amount of memory used for pivot tables and all other applications cannot exceed 4 gigabytes. If you're starting out working with pivot tables, having a generalized list of steps to follow may be useful to help you get comfortable working with pivot tables. The first step is to create or import a dataset from another worksheet or application. Next, you'll need to structure your data in a format that Excel can use to create a pivot table. The third step is to clean the data so Excel will accept the data for the pivot table. The fourth step is to transform the data so that it will provide useful results. Fifth, sketch out what the pivot table should look like when it is complete. For beginners, this is an extremely useful step. The sixth and final step is creating the pivot table. Let's take a detailed look at each of these steps. The data for a pivot table may come from a variety of sources. One method is to enter the data manually from a keyboard. Obviously, manually entering data is the least efficient way to enter a data set. Another method is to open an existing workbook containing the data. Most of the time, the data will be imported from a text file in either a tab-separated value format, a comma-separated value format, or another text file format. Often users will import data from database applications such as Access, SQL Server, or Oracle. Finally, a data connection between two workbooks may be created. The data for the pivot table must exist in a columnar database where the columns represent fields and the rows represent records. The worksheet on the left is a columnar database. Notice that each column represents a single type of data, for example, a username. The worksheet on the right is not in a columnar database format. Another aspect of preparing to build a pivot table is understanding the data. First, know what fields are in the dataset by reviewing the fields. Also review the types of values found in each column. For example, does the column contain text values, numerical values, dates or times, numerals, logical values, or formulas? Data cleaning means checking the raw data to see if it contains problems that will prevent the creation of the pivot table or interfere with the analysis of the data. There are 4 basic sources of potential data issues. First, check for blank columns between fields. Excel does not permit the creation of a pivot table from a dataset with an empty column in it. The column needs at least to have a name to be considered a valid field. The best way to deal with the situation is to delete the blank column. Second, check for blank rows. Excel will allow a blank row in the dataset it uses for a pivot table. However, it will create a separate category for any blank values in the dataset. Generally, it is the best practice to avoid having blanks in the pivot table unless the pivot table is being used to look for blanks. Finally, blank rows make selecting the data more difficult because the user will need to select the dataset instead of letting Excel do the work of selecting the data. Third, check for blank or missing values. Different versions of Excel handle missing values differently. In versions 2016 and earlier, Excel treats the missing values as text. If the column contains numbers with one cell in the column containing a blank, Excel considers the whole column as containing text. If the field is in the value areas of the pivot table, it will count the number of the occurrences of the numerals instead of performing any calculation by default. Further, while the user can force Excel to perform a calculation, the results may be skewed downward because Excel will replace the missing value with a 0. For example, some statistical calculations such as average, standard deviation, and variance are heavily dependent on the data values, and zeros tend to skew the results. In Excel 365 and Excel 2019, Excel omits any missing values from the calculation. Finally, take a minute to check the data type of each of the fields, especially fields containing numbers and dates. Sometimes when Excel imports data from an outside source, it imports numbers and dates in a text format, and this potentially causes problems when manipulating the data within the pivot table. Sometimes when getting a data set from an outside source or using multiple sources, the data may need to be transformed. If a user imports multiple tables from a database, the tables may need to be linked together in Excel. For example, a firm's sales database contains a table of transactions with an identification number of the salesperson associated with the transaction. If the information about the salesperson resides in another table and we want to display the salesperson's name and transactions, the two tables must be merged or linked. Excel offers a variety of techniques to accomplish this goal, as you will learn in a later video. Another transformation data is combining two or more fields into a new field. For example, if the salesperson's first name and last name are in separate fields, then combining them into a single field might make the pivot table more readable. Sometimes the field needs to be split into its parts. For example, if a field contains a customer's city, state, and postal code, then splitting the field into 3 separate fields might make the data in the field more useful. Finally, new data may be generated based upon existing data. For example, a report may contain the quantity of a good purchased and the unit price of the good, but not the total amount of the purchase. If the pivot table design requires the total amount of the purchase, the user may want to calculate it before creating the pivot table. The second to last step in creating a pivot table is thinking about the pivot table itself. Specifically, the pivot table should attempt to help you answer a question or convey something meaningful to another individual. Once you have an idea why you want the pivot table, sketching a diagram of what you want the pivot table to look like when you create it should help you figure out where to place the fields. While this step is not necessary, many individuals starting to work with pivot tables find it useful to have a visual guide to the final product. As you gain experience, you will find that you will be able to visualize the pivot table you want without having to sketch it. While creating the sketch, there are several questions to answer. 1. Which fields will supply the row labels? 2. Which fields will supply the column labels? 3. Which fields will supply the values? 4. Which fields will supply the filter values? 5. What calculated fields does the pivot table need? 6. What calculated items does the pivot table need? The process of actually creating a pivot table is very straightforward. 1. Select the data set. 2. Decide where you want to place the pivot table in the workbook. Generally, pivot table creators place the first pivot table on a worksheet different from the worksheet containing the data set. 3. Place the fields for the rows, columns, values, and filters into the appropriate parts of the pivot table based upon your sketch. 4. Create any calculated fields or any calculated items. 5. Sort, filter, and group the pivot table. 6. If you want a pivot chart, then create the pivot chart after you've created the pivot table. In the next video, you will learn how to create a simple pivot table.